people set up here as well. Right, that's it, shut the door, lock it. All right, Kate, do you want to take over?
Okay, good. Yeah, afternoon now, isn't it? Thanks, just about. My name's Kate Hutchinson. I quite happily describe myself as a trans rights activist in a time when putting that title on myself probably puts me up for attack via social media every single day. Apart from that, I work for a number of charities. I do stuff with All About Trans, about media representation. I volunteer with them. I facilitate some things for them. I'm the director of an organisation called Wipe Out Transphobia, which is like an international project to raise awareness. In my day job, I work for a charity called Diversity Role Models. We're an LGBT plus charity that basically go into schools to try and prevent and tackle homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying through, using role models. Funny enough, we get people from the community come into schools with us and tell their true life experiences. And we find those experiences have so much impact. In fact, I can see a couple of our role models in this room today. A lot of this talk is around a personal narrative of how I've seen the media growing up, how I've seen it related to trans people and my own, awareness. So for me, the first tinglings of my transness, to use a phrase, probably around the age of 5 or 6. I remember one incident. I was standing in the schoolyard at break time. Who do I go and play with? One side there's all the boys playing games boys like to play. This is the 70s. It's really gendered. I mean, I know it's very gendered now, but a lot more so. Where you used to line up as lines of boys and girls just to go into the school after break. On the right hand side, there were all the girls playing games girls like to play. For me, it was a no-brainer. It's like all my friends generally with girls, felt more comfortable with them, so I went and played with the girls. That's when a teacher stopped me, and she said, "Leave the girls alone. Stop bothering them. Go and play with the boys because that's what you are." What did I do? Burst into tears. So it was always put on me as a shameful thing to show that side of me. So I kept that hidden deep. As I grew up, my childhood marched on. Went into my adolescence and my feelings of disconnection started to grow. But there was no one I could see who was anything like me. Then I started to see headlines in newspapers. When I was around 10 or 11, I started to maybe take interest in some of those things. Tabloid articles about trans people. Articles that always generally made fun of the person. All I ever saw, though, was somebody like me. That's when the light bulb went off. Those red top headlines, like these, full of sensationalist, attention-grabbing humiliation. Sex swap shocker, she's my dad. Or some of these we see on the screens here. The ones on the left there are relating to Dr. Kate Stone. Basically, there was an incident where she was gored by a deer. Absolutely horrific thing to happen. And the press, when they got hold of the story, decided instead of talking about the horrific accident, to make it all about her gender identity. And we got the middle one there, which is about Christine Jorgensen, who was one of probably the first really high-profile trans women to be seen and talked about in the media. And I think she transitioned in about 1952. And she was a worldwide phenomenon at the time, the way the press actually followed her. But it was always generally a negative or sensationalist thing. Sometime, though, in the early 80s, I saw something that both raised hopes and terrified me at the same time. There was a BBC Inside Story documentary, A Change of Sex. It chronicled the transition of trans woman Julia Grant.
So you feel like a woman? Yes, I believe everything I do is feminine.
Can you hear that?
I believe I'm a woman inside.
Well, Michelle, how does it feel to be a woman?
It just feels like being me. Can't describe it as anything else.
You see, she's right. Nobody knows how anybody else feels inside.
Well, I believe I don't actually feel the way a normal man should feel.
maybe that you identify with certain stereotypes of the female gender role, but that doesn't make you a woman. I'm not prepared to consider any other approach until you've done one year as a female from the date which I have in the notes. If you don't like that, well, then you must find another doctor.
Julia had to break the news to John Randall that she'd acted without his approval.
Well, what's been happening to you since I saw you last?
Since I last saw you, I've had the bust operation done.
Well, I must confess I take exception to your doing that.
Well, I thought it was something permanent. I needed something to establish that I was doing what I was doing.
It's a medical matter, just a personal choice. I like to be informed. See, once again, you're overstepping the mark. I don't like it. Not a bit.
Julia had reduced her chances of having the operation on the NHS. Like other transsexuals, she would have to look at the option of private surgery.
Yeah, I heard a few expressions there, and rightly so. I mean, that show though, for me and quite a lot of other people, that lit a light bulb in a big way. For a lot of trans people who were not out yet, trying to find themselves. Here we saw a walking, talking trans woman, a person who we could identify with completely in full colour on our TV screens in our front rooms. Julia was somebody who showed, just by her visibility there, that it was possible to embrace your true self, to live your truth. But those scenes, you know, showing Julia in the gender identity clinic with clinician John Randall, that terrified me. That made you feel it was something to be ashamed of. His constant denial of her identity, his outrage at her breast augmentation, that raised feelings then of doubt, of shame, and then, you know, pushed a lot of people, you know, to hide it away again. I know I've spoken to another few trans friends who talk about that documentary, saying about how Randall's attitude in that basically put a lot of people off transitioning in a big way, even though he was a clinician who was supposed to be there helping. That had a huge negative impact. So those tabloid press articles, Julia's documentary, in the early 80s for me, that was about as far as I saw it with trans visibility. I secretly videotaped that documentary when I was about 11 or 12, you know, hid the tape inside, you know, inside the bottom of my bed so my mum might not find it. I used to cut those, you know, negative press articles out of papers like News of the World, all of these little bits like that, because even though they were negative, they were the only thing that I could see that gave me validation of myself, the only visible sign. The only other things around that time, you know, that ever really spoke about transition were maybe out of reach medical journals, but also memoirs. Those such as Christine Jorgensen's life story there and Jan Morris's Conundrum. But even these books could bring up anxiety in just trying to obtain them. Because if you think about it then, just even trying to obtain them, you would order it, go into a bookshop, because you couldn't order it on the internet back then. So you'd have to interact with somebody to get hold of these books. And then you'd think people are going to ask me questions. Why are you reading about this? What's your interest in this? You know, it would bring all those anxieties, so you just wouldn't engage there. So I was in high school, or comprehensive school back then in the 1980s. And for anyone struggling with their gender identity back then, there was nowhere to turn for help or advice, no visible role models, no organisations such as Mermaids, no internet, no Facebook with all of its secret online peer support groups, which we have nowadays. No one within my school environment who I could, you know, who I felt comfortable or could actually engage with. Thinking back to how alone and desperate I felt back then, it really highlights still the importance of LGBT and trans inclusion in the curriculum today. Things have improved greatly, but we've still got so far to go and that progress needs to be made. So yeah, the press articles, television documentaries, they were the only mainstream visibility. There were other mediums though, where society's accepted boundaries of gender were starting to be pushed. Within the music business, There's been several bands and artists appearing that always blurred those gender boundaries, because pop and rock music has always been a catalyst for social change, a haven for the misfit, the misunderstood, the rebel. It's always been a medium for form and expression and thought, and the one shining beacon that lit my way through the 80s was music. It kept me going. Discovering rock music and artists within pop and rock that were out there, queer and authentic, that was a complete inspiration to a struggling and confused teenager. So there was a big moment of realisation for me. I was 11 years old, in the front room of my parents' house in the northwest of England, on a Thursday night, engaging in our weekly televisual ritual. Television, tuned to BBC One, the rotating globe of the BBC logo of the day, followed by the announcer's voice. It's Thursday night, it's 7 o'clock, it's Top of the Pops. Top of the Pops, if you're not aware, because it's, or isn't it, they bring it back, it's on at Christmas, isn't it? It was a weekly BBC television show that showcased the best of the music charts of the day. Apparently this one particular night, Shakin' Stevens couldn't make it. So, that's an age reference as well. Instead, they had a new band on. Now, within 5 seconds of George appearing on that screen, George isn't trans, but bear with me on this. My parents came out with a line, and you can probably guess what this is going to be. Is that a boy, or is that a girl? Now, for an 11-year-old who was really struggling with their gender identity, ideas of their expression of their self, seeing somebody like that who was so expressive, he was colourful, he was expressive, ribbons in his hair there, makeup, clothing that was so individual. Here was a person that you couldn't initially place into one of those gender binary boxes that society loves so much. So he's not trans, George, but for a young music-loving, gender-questioning person, to see somebody blurring those lines of gender like that, through that outward expression, that gave me a lot to think about. It gave me a lot of hope. He was unashamedly being himself. To see him projecting that through his image, that lit a bit of a fire of hope in there, kept the flame going, that, hey, if there's somebody who's just being themselves and not caring what people think about that, then maybe I could find that strength somewhere. For that young kid watching Top of the Pops, that was everything. He wasn't the only one. Jumping ahead. Of course, how can I not mention David Bowie? He showed how identity could be fluid. He took expression, gender, sexuality, shaped it, moulded it into something that was uniquely him. Constantly shifting with his identity, not constrained by society's rigid opinions of how people should look, how they should sound, how they should love. But he was a role model to me, and George was a role model to me as being, to the kid who didn't fit in the role I was told I was supposed to. In the last few years, we've seen more trans music artists coming out and proud to be themselves. Laura Jane Grace of Against Me, but she's not the first. First visible trans woman I ever became aware of in rock music was Jane County. Jane County started off, Jane County had a history in New York. Well, she's from Atlanta. She moved to New York. She was part of the whole Andy Warhol Superstars. She was at Stonewall. She went under a different stage name at the time. She went under a male stage name, and yet her expression always altered quite radically. She moved to England at one point in the mid-70s, started a band called the Electric Chairs. When I first heard about Jane, it absolutely blew me away. I've got some of her lyrics here. I got a transsexual feeling. It's hard to be true to the one that's really you. I got a scandalous feeling. It's hard to be true when they point and stare at you. Conditioned to portraying the mask of masculinity. Another blend of different shading. I am what I am, I don't give a damn. And that was in the mid-80s, you know. Her empowerment was inspirational to many a trans music fan who still sat in the closet. Her image, as well as her lyrics, were completely unapologetic. I loved her empowerment. This was positive trans audibility in the 80s. You know, because when I started hearing about her singing about being man enough to be a woman, I heard lyrics that gave me validation and something to hang on to. How could I not include this wonderful person? So that was music. And as things went on then into the 90s and into the mid to late 90s, you started to see a bit more filtering through on TV. Through the rising popularity of reality TV shows, and also the arrival of our first sort of trans character in a mainstream, you know, British soap opera, Hayley Patterson, Cropper. At the time, you know, early on, there was a lot of discussion about the fact that it wasn't a trans actress playing this role. What a lot of people are not aware of, that a lot of consultation was done with the community in the background. Christine Burns of Press for Change and Annie Wallace, who now has the character of Miss St Clair in Hollyoaks, there were people who were involved, you know, in advising with Hayley. But she brought trans awareness, funnily enough, into the population's, you know, view in a big way. She wasn't the only one. I mean, personally, I remember also seeing reality TV documentaries. One in particular I remember called Paddington Green. One of the people followed in that documentary was a trans woman called Jackie McAuliffe. She was a sex worker just trying to get on with her life. And seeing her portrayed in that show just built up a lot of empathy, because here's somebody who you could see was struggling, really struggling to get through things, but was so authentically being herself and just getting through it. She didn't want pity, she just got on with it, and she got what she needed to get in her own way. Also reality TV wise, we've got to mention Big Brother, because Big Brother's always been quite positive up to a point regarding trans people. I would say about the most recent, you know, celebrity Big Brother things. But we had Nadia winning it one year, and we had Luke as well later on, you know, fairly recently. And they were really positive, you know, they were sort of positive role models, really. What's different about a lot of these shows then in the 90s, end of the 90s, with characters or trans people as subjects in it, they built more empathy rather than sympathy. We weren't an object of ridicule. Seeing Jackie in that show, she was the person who basically triggered me to come out to friends I was living in at the time. I was sat there one evening and literally came out with it while we were sitting watching the TV documentary when I was sharing a house with two friends. That was my first attempt at transition. But then, it still has its ups and downs. The change in attitudes, so late 90s, early 2000s, it was starting to sink into our culture. Acceptance, understanding, into the wider public through that visibility. No longer that object of pity, and eventually getting rid of, you know, you don't see much of this type of thing anymore. Comedy sketch shows with Little Britain where they're really blatantly having a go at a trans person. You know, Emily Howard and the "I'm a lady" and all of that. I still find it pretty offensive, and a lot of people still defend it. One thing you might have noticed a lack of up to this point is, where's all the trans guys? Where's all the trans masculine people? Where's all the non-binary people? It's the thing with the media, they tend to be very obsessed with trans women. There has been more increased visibility in more recent years now of non-binary people and trans masculine people, trans guys. But a lot of it's always been around that fascination with bodies, and also the way sometimes anything seen to do anything feminine always still gets shamed for some reason in society, which I think's, you know, still a huge problem. Yeah, just those bits of visibility, not these, but you know, other people like that. If you were not out and you saw that on TV, that made a heck of a difference. You saw somebody like you. In the last few years, we've seen a heck of an explosion in trans documentaries, you know, in the last few weeks. I know there's a thing coming on ITV Wales this week on around the news about the situation within Wales. Some documentaries have been critical. We saw that, I don't know if anyone's seen the trans children one that the BBC did, which basically attacked the support of young people. How can you actually do that? We're trying to save lives with this, you know. Some have been, most are generally supportive, but they don't, most of them don't always quite get it right. This is how I'd actually like to see representation. No, not that. So, a shot of me, not always like that, say, just standing, me looking to camera, speaking to camera myself, in a pair of jeans, not much makeup on, saying, hi, my name's Kate, I'm 47 years old, I live in North Wales with my Great Dane called Lionel, I work for a charity, I really love my job, I love life, oh yeah, I'm trans. How the media likes to portray trans people. Makeup mirror, lipstick. Shot of trans woman wearing heels, dress, lots of makeup, looking in a mirror, putting more makeup on. Now, I'm not attacking any people who are in the documentaries here. I'm talking about the way the production of the programmes are. This is Kate. Kate is 47 years old. She struggled with her inner turmoil all of her life over this. She was born a boy named Lee. She's not had surgery yet, but she takes female hormones to change her body and grow breasts. That's how it is. I mean, you could hear the laugh. And it's that sort of stereotypes, those tropes that are always used. They always go after the sympathy angle, where really it is about empathy that we need. It's about understanding. How are we for time?
You're all right. I'm. Yeah. Go on.
Yeah. So, it is getting better. For me, though, it was always seeing those negative things that would push me back sometimes. You'd hear other people talking about those documentaries who might be like cisgender or criticising or not really supportive of the trans community. And that would, hearing that negative language, attitude, that would make you think, they just see me as an object to laugh at on TV or to point fingers at. Eventually, though, for myself trying to transition at the end of the 90s, I made my move to transition successfully around 2012, end of 2012. And that was shortly after I saw another piece of media. Anyone recognise this picture, this show? Channel 4's My Transsexual Summer. I saw that programme and that's what did it for me. It was a show that just put a bunch of trans people into a house together to share and explore parts of their lives and their identities. It wasn't without its problems. It was far from perfect. I know a couple of people that were involved in the show have problems with the way they were portrayed within that show. Mostly, I think it was most of the trans guys and non-binary folks in there. You know, it had that sort of narration in the background still going on, you know, the sympathetic voice using phrases like changing sex all the way through it. But what was really good is that you saw real people talking to other real people with those same issues. And for me, I remember seeing one person on there in particular who I identified a lot with. I remember seeing Sarah Savage on there, and she was early in her transition at that point, and I saw Sarah and I thought, wow, I sort of get a lot of where you're coming from with this, and that set me thinking a lot. And that, I know that show did so much for a lot of people as far as coming out. That was really positive role models and, you know, positive visibility. To the fact that after that show, There's a number of people in that show now who are fantastic advocates for the trans community. You've seen Fox Fisher now. There's a lot of work around non-binary activism and trans activism. Makes some fantastic trans-made content, some trans-made media, and that's what we need to see more of, I think. You know, if anyone knows our voice, it's ourselves. Of course, yeah, we've seen Lewis as well, and Sarah, who continues, you know, to do a lot of activism still. It's a really long walk out of the darkness. Slowly, we're beginning to see the light as far as media portrayal goes. We're seeing more trans positive visibility now. A trans person on TV is no longer a thing. We have actors playing trans roles. We have Annie Wallace and Annie Wallace, who was playing Miss Sinclair in Hollyoaks, who still is, and we had Rebecca Root as well in Boy Meets Girl, which was a light-hearted comedy that did a lot more as well to, you know, raise awareness of just trans visibility. Trans journalists now appearing on TV to talk about things that have nothing to do with being trans, which is great. You know, we see Paris a lot now on Paris Lees a lot on various TV things where she's not talking anything to do with being trans in some cases, and that's really good to see, because you know what, we're just people at the end of the day. Trans people are just people. We want to get on with our lives just as part of society, just like any other human being. We have hopes, we have dreams, we have ambitions. To be represented in the media in that way, and not as some wondrous and special butterfly body for the nation to ogle. That's what we just love, just to be seen as people. We're nothing special, we're just people. Thank you.